This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 9th, 1953, 25-year-old Lester Buddy Hunt Jr., who was the president of the student body at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is arrested in Washington, D.C. for soliciting sex from a male undercover police officer just north of the White House. The agent who arrested Buddy Hunt was part of a so-called pervert elimination squad, part of J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy's ramped-up anti-LGBT efforts in D.C. in the 1950s. So yes, there was a pervert elimination squad, and we will get to that larger context. But who was this Lester Hunt Jr.? He was more than just a star student at a theological school. He was the son of Democrat Lester Hunt, former governor and, at the time, senator from Wyoming. So we have the son of a very prominent politician being arrested in an anti-LGBT sting. And after his son's arrest, this kicked off a sinister, twisted, and ultimately really tragic series of events in which Hunt, the elder, was basically blackmailed by parts of the government into leaving politics. His life was derailed. A despondent Lester Hunt Sr. commits suicide the following summer. So it's a story of the government's persecution of gays, the so-called lavender scare led by McCarthy and Hoover, and of course a family tragedy with big political implications. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
What a twisty, turny, tragic, but really riveting, fascinating story. One thing worth clearing up, because I kind of had to clear it up for myself, but when you're talking about a family named the Hunts who are prominent in the middle of the 20th century, my mind goes to the Hunts of Texas, and as far as I can tell, these are not related to those Hunts, but the John Birch Society and now the Kansas City Chief Hunts, all those folks are connected, but this is a separate group of Hunts from Wyoming. Is that right?
Different sides of the political spectrum.
And different sides of the political spectrum. I think that's right as well. Though a Democrat in the mid-50s, who knows. But yes, different group of Hunts. But let's go through this story sort of beat by beat. I mean, Buddy Hunt Jr., who is back in D.C., presumably visiting his parents, he gets caught up in this sting. Do we know anything about what happens in the immediate aftermath of the arrest? And then obviously we should talk about this larger so-called lavender scare that leads to incidents like this.
So the arrest happens as part of a sting, which is to say that there were laws against sodomy. And so the police, rather than just kind of letting people go about their lives, would go to the places where gay men were known to frequent. They would solicit from them, or they would put themselves out to be solicited. And when that happened, then the men would be arrested. Those arrests could be devastating because not only was being gay a crime, it was also socially unacceptable. You could lose your job, especially if you worked in the federal government. You could lose your reputation. There was so much tied up into it. And the government was out there trying to entrap people in order to make these arrests. This happens to Buddy Hunt Jr., and he is ultimately not prosecuted at the time, probably in part because he has these close connections to a senator. But that's kind of what unfolds that night as far as the arrest. The politics of it unfold in the days that follow.
Well, let me ask you one question about the politics. I mean, obviously, McCarthy is a big part of this. And as we said, McCarthy is sort of on this anti-LGBT crusade. This is sort of around the same time, but I would say it's sort of a warm-up act to his real anti-communism crusades and hearings. Lester Hunt Sr., the senator, is kind of an enemy of McCarthy and critical of the sort of tactics that he's using to go after folks. Is there any indication here that they specifically targeted his son in this sting, or is it just sort of a but a sort of, convenient coincidence that the son of one of his political enemies gets arrested in this way?
That's such a good question. I mean, I haven't seen evidence. Yeah.
I mean, that's all to say. This story is just full of all sorts of these moments where you're like, gosh, how deep this go and how twisted is this,
Yeah. I wondered, too, how much there was animosity built up between Hunt and McCarthy before this incident, and how much after the incident their relationship or disdain for each other was even more, pronounced. Nothing surprises me, so I put nothing past anyone. Yeah. But I will say that this moment takes sort of the relationship between Hunt and McCarthy to a whole new level of destruction, I think is maybe the best word to say, in terms of how McCarthy is weaponizing this arrest against Hunt for all kinds of political reasons. And everyone is aware of that this could not just damage his son, but damage his father to the point where he may have to resign. And given that there is a tight, narrow lead in the Senate with Democrats and Republicans, this could be a major seat change if he had to forego his Senate seat.
Yeah. To give it more of a beat by beat, because I think this actually gets to your question too, Jody, about was this planned? So the arrest doesn't make the pages of the newspaper. There's not this big prosecution that follows, but somehow McCarthy learns about this arrest. So do all of his allies in the Senate. And two senators, Stiles Bridges and Herman Welker, say to Hunt, reportedly, that if he does not retire, if he does not resign from the Senate and agree not to run again, then they would make sure that his son was prosecuted. They would put his son's arrest in all of the newspapers. And as Kellie was saying, if he had resigned, he would have had his replacement appointed by a Republican. It could have switched the balance of power in the Senate. Not only is he getting that pressure from these McCarthyite senators, but also the Eisenhower administration is trying to get him out of this seat. They're kind of like the good cop to the bad cop.
Yeah. But they're still a cop.
Still a cop. To still want him out of that seat. Probably know about the pressure that's being put on him by these Republican senators. They're like, we can give you a position on the U.S. Tariff Commission. It pays really well, but you just have to promise never to run for the Senate again. So he is getting a lot of pressure. And again, if this is exposed about his son, it could ruin his son's life.
Yeah, potentially, yes, ruin his son's life and potentially ruin his career as well.
Sure.
I mean, we're living in that moment. So, yes, he feels the pressure. Pressure's being applied to him directly. Pressure's being applied by the Eisenhower administration. Pressure's being applied on the cops.
Yes, to prosecute.
Right, to prosecute, because Hunt basically says, no, I won't bow to this. I'm not going to resign. At least at first he says that. And so there is other forms of pressure. The police have a quote-unquote morals division, that prosecutes these kinds of crimes and runs these kinds of stings. And the leader of that is being, the people are getting in his ear about prosecuting Buddy Hunt or Lester Hunt Jr. So eventually, Hunt Sr. says he won't resign and plans to run again. And then his son is prosecuted. They go through with the threat. The elder Hunt attends the trial, and it seems to really, really affect him to have to go see that and have his family go through that.
Yeah. I mean, it's devastating. And he actually starts to have major health issues as a result of this. He comes out sort of saying that he will be undaunted and that he will run again. In April of 1954, he says he's going to run, despite the threats, despite the blackmail and all of the hard road ahead. And then about a month or 6 weeks later, he sort of changes his mind and he's like, my health really can't take this campaign. And I'm not only am I not going to run, but I'm never going to be a candidate for an elected office. And that's June 8th. And then about 2 weeks after that, he commits suicide in his office. Sitting at his Senate desk with the gun that he brought from home.
It's such a tragic story, and it gets reported in the newspaper just as his son's arrest had. The New York Times says that in apparent despondency over his health, so they don't connect it to his son, that he had died by suicide. He'd left notes. And yet, it isn't huge front page news on every newspaper across the country. These stories are reported at the time, but it isn't the same kind of sensational coverage that you would imagine today. I mean, if a senator died by suicide at their desk today...
Huge.
The conspiracy theories, the coverage, the state funerals, there just would be so just that like endless coverage of it. But this is kind of quiet. It's an enormous tragedy at the end of a series of events that didn't have to happen.
Yeah.
What kind of things did you write growing up? Did you write diaries or love letters or melodramatic poetry about the fate of mankind? And could you ever imagine getting on stage and reading those things in front of strangers? I know that I've basically memory holed a lot of that stuff, and no thank you, I am not interested in that. But luckily, plenty of people are, and the result is our fellow Radiotopia show, the Mortified podcast. It is back with new episodes celebrating the 20th anniversary of the stage show that inspired the podcast. There's more laughs, more teenage writings, more awkwardness. In fact, Mortified is hosting its first ever Tournament of Teen Angst, where participants like this person compete for the title of Most Mortified.
January 12th. I keep looking at Matt, and he then stares at me. I wish he stared at me because he likes me, not because he knows I stare at him.
So go check it out, and congrats to Mortified, one of the OG Radiotopia podcasts, on this incredible milestone, 20 years of their live show. The podcast is really wonderful listening. Mortified, wherever you get your podcasts. So, look, the reporting, such as it was at the time, and the story that emerges is that Hunt was really suffering from bad health. Did his health deteriorate as a total coincidence in the period between when his son was arrested and all this pressure was put on him and his family was being strained and this moment? I don't know. But I can't imagine it was a total coincidence. And moreover, and this is another one of those moments where you just sort of see the conspiracy theory plausibly open up before you. But just the day before Hunt's suicide, McCarthy had given a sort of quote in a speech where he talked anonymously about an unnamed member of the Senate, but had just referred to that person as a wrongdoer. And, a lot of people connected the dots and said, gosh, McCarthy still has it out for Hunt and is still kind of talking about this guy and threatening him and applying this kind of pressure, And then, of course, McCarthy's allies in the wake of the suicide say, oh, there was no connection. He wasn't referring to Hunt. But there is also more and more a trickle of understanding that these things might be connected, including a local columnist, Drew Pearson, who I think is one of the first in the days after the suicide to say, and he writes a column and he says, this was, quote, one of the lowest types of political pressure this writer has seen in many years. And then in the summer, a little more information about Buddy Hunt Jr.'s arrest comes out, and I think people start to realize, oh, there was a bigger story here that led to Lester Hunt Sr.'s death.
Everything becomes a much bigger story. And July 4th, when this conservative Washington Times-Herald runs a story about Hunt's arrest, his conviction from the previous year, they connect it to Hunt's death. And then sort of the story gets traction in ways that it never did when the incidents first happened. I feel terrible for Hunt's family because his poor wife and his son, they're grieving the loss of their husband and father, and they can't seem to catch a break because nothing gets quiet after this. As a matter of fact, the press and the media get louder and louder, talking about these rumors and allegations.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there isn't much in the way of a force that is trying to get the word out and point the finger at McCarthy. This story begins to die out in 1954. And Hunt's widow is particularly eager to see this story go away because every time somebody talks about this story, it re-raises the issue of her son's sexuality. And not only was there an enormous stigma around homosexuality at the time, but the stigma around suicide was terrible. And people didn't talk about it. And when they did talk about it, they talked about it as this very shameful thing. And so she's carrying all of this shame throughout her life that prevents the story from really being fully told until after her death in the 1980s.
Yeah. So we'll get to that sort of family fallout, including with the son, Buddy Hunt Jr. But in terms of political fallout, I mean, a Democrat does eventually the fall after Hunt's suicide, win that Senate seat. In the fall also, there's a ceremony at the Senate for members who had died recently. And we've mentioned this on the show before, but I think it was 9 senators died just crazy in that 2-year stretch. I mean, it was just sort of insane. One real kind of sinister messed up thing here is that the person who eulogized Hunt during that ceremony was that guy Styles Bridges, who reportedly was the one who applied pressure initially on behalf of McCarthy in the wake of Buddy Hunt's arrest. So, yes, I mean, all sorts of twists. I mean, imagine what the widow must have felt seeing that.
And can we say, for perspective, 9 senators dying in about a 2-year period is mind-boggling to us, considering that we've had about 9 senators die since 2000.
Yeah. Niki, you did mention that McCarthy doesn't really feel fallout from this. He continues to operate. I mean, there is a overwhelming sort of censure vote of him that fall. And I wonder how much that is a little bit related to the Senate body feeling like, okay, this guy has pushed the envelope a little too far.
Yeah, I think it certainly plays into it. It's the reason that I said that is because he continues to operate pretty aggressively in the months that follow, right? He's not immediately constrained by Hunt's death. Instead, he continues to push. He continues to drag people before his committee. He continues to question them. He continues to ruin lives. And we've talked about McCarthy on the show before, and I think we've also talked about that moment when the attorney Welch asked, have you no decency, sir? Yeah. I think this is a piece of the puzzle when it comes to figuring out why McCarthy is finally censured and brought down. The wild thing is that after a senator dies by suicide in the Senate in a way that is related to McCarthy's investigations, that it takes any time at all for him to be censured and the reins put on him.
Yeah. Actually, interesting little coincidence. That line, that moment, that have you no decency, sir moment where someone pushes back against McCarthy during a hearing was on this day. It was 1 year after Buddy Hunt Jr. was arrested.
Incredible.
And so you see this sort of summer 1953 to summer 1954, just the pressure just rising.
Yeah, because people were tired of his bullyingness and his, shenanigans.
But, he had the weight of the FBI and Hoover and the government behind him, so he was certainly able to push forward. I don't think this story can be read at all as a kind of moment of rebuke or a moment of kind of self-awareness on the part of the McCarthy camp for how hard they were pushing on this. All right, so to wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the fallout for the family. I mean, you talked about how his wife was totally consumed by these twin shames, as you described them. Yeah. The son, who was arrested, and Buddy Hunt, was young at the time, and he continues to live. He only died in the last few years.
Yeah, 2020. At 92. At 92.
But he does not talk about this for a long, long time. And this story is basically hidden until what? Until like the 70s? And then it kind of comes back up a little bit later into the 2000s. His first on-camera interview is in 2015 about this. It's just kind of stunning for this family to keep this secret for so long.
Buddy Jr. blamed himself. He believed that he was the reason for his dad's suicide. He didn't know, or he was unaware, that his father had been blackmailed and that they had threatened to print 25,000 pamphlets exposing his son's conviction in Wyoming if he did not step down. And so that whole smear campaign was not known to him. And so I can't imagine the kind of guilt or grief that he would have thinking that he was to blame for his father's death.
He had grown up to become a community organizer, and he finds out, in the making of this documentary that this blackmail campaign had happened. And he actually writes to then Attorney General Loretta Lynch and requests a formal review of the case. Because he's like, I'm in my mid-80s. This is the first I'm hearing about this. What actually happened? And I don't know that we know the full extent of any sort of review that happened, but it certainly seems like something that we would want to find out who knew what when.
Yeah. And again, going back to Jody's original question of was this a trap?
Yeah. I don't know. There was a 1959 novel called Advise and Consent that was then made into a film. Do you know that film, Advise and Consent? When we start our movie club, we'll
That's right.
We'll watch that together, if it's any good. Okay, well, let's leave it there with the story of Lester Buddy Hunt Sr. and Jr. Let's do a couple also on this day. These are other things that happened on June 9th through the years.
On June 9th, 1972, heavy rains triggered record flooding in the Black Hills of South Dakota. The resulting disaster left at least 238 people dead and $164 million in damage.
And in 1993, the science fiction film Jurassic Park, directed by Steven Spielberg, had its world premiere in Washington, D.C.
Gonna
Love
get
that movie.
Dinosaurs soon.
Why did Jurassic Park premiere in Washington, D.C.? What's that theater? Now I'm blanking on the name of that big theater. I guess they used to do big premieres there.
Weird place to do it.
Yeah.
Maybe they were trying to move policy, pro-dinosaur policy.
Yeah, I bet you there was a very, very interesting guest list
No
at that
kidding.
premiere. We should
Do you
go look it up.
remember when everyone thought that movie was for kids and kids were screaming in the theater because it was not at all for kids?
Oh, I think a lot of people our age, their formative, terrifying movie experience was that little girl hiding as the
With the jello shaking.
I don't like it.
Velociraptor. Yeah. 2004, Ronald Reagan arrived in Washington, D.C. to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda before the 40th president's funeral.
And in 2020, hundreds of mourners packed a Houston church for the funeral of George Floyd on this day.
George Floyd killed Memorial Day weekend in 2020. I don't know. This is a sort of minor thought on this, and I guess this is no great insight, but I just continue to just marvel at how compressed everything in spring and into summer of 2020 was. And all of these sort of foundational seismic incidents happening just within a matter of weeks is just kind of stunning. I don't know if we've fully gotten our heads around it.
2020 sucked.
Yep.
Yeah, 2020 sucked. But that the George Floyd captivating, was just a few weeks after lockdown. I mean, it just, everything moved fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, well, we will leave it there. And a reminder that we're doing a lot more also on this days and some analysis in our newsletter. You can sign up for that at thisdaypod.com. Thanks to everyone who has signed up, and especially thanks to everyone who has forwarded that to people to spread the word and get them to sign up. So we really appreciate that. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from